Could be trouble. Could be an opportunity. If it isn't Southside Jamaica's very own resurrected Lamb of God.
Just like Jesus, I died for the sins.
Now, what will Unique's next move be now that he's finally come out of the shadows, shown Rock that he's alive? He's made his move in the streets, made his move to protect Panessa and Jerome. But how does Unique now plan to get stronger, build his organization, and essentially squash his competition and enemy for good? What's his play? Because you can guarantee Rock will want to hit back. She knows they can't hit him back at this moment in time because he's completely taken them by surprise. Marvin of course wants to hit back with force, as he always does, but Rock knows at this moment in time they can't. They need to keep their pistols in their pockets and build a battle plan. But in that time, just how strong will Unique actually be? He's got Quan as a connect, Bill Russo's backing in terms of money, resources and soldiers, which was a connect out in Trenton Akbar. These guys strolled into Southside and took Rock's corners, and they ain't going anywhere anytime soon. We also have to remember he also had this conversation with Snaps and Pop. Now what was actually said in this conversation, we don't actually know, but that's the topic of discussion in today's breakdown. In our previous breakdown, we looked at this from Marvin and Rock's perspective and their Italian problem. But how does Unique play this going into the home stretch? And how does Kanan fit into all of this? Because I do think he will end up being at the center of a huge storm in the rest of All Things Raising Kanan Season 4. Now in terms of Unique's conversation with Rock, and him finally revealing he's alive and well, or well as he can be, I do think we have to remind ourselves, Unique may be back to looking like he never left. He might be back to wearing the flashy clothes, the red leather jacket, the fur jacket a bit later on. Unique looking like Unique, but it's definitely important for us to remember, this is someone who's still suffering from CTE. Both Sasha Penn and Joey Badass mentioned in a number of interviews prior to Season 4, the brain injury that he suffered isn't any normal brain injury. I've read stories from nurses where they've mentioned they've seen this happen to a lot of their patients. Some know of a lot of people in the streets who have suffered something very similar, but they come back angry, they lose their patience easily, have a short fuse and a temper. And that's exactly what we saw from Unique in 407. The German Shepherd the doctor spoke of back in 401. He might be back to looking like Unique, but as I mentioned in my breakdown for 401, the physical recovery is going to be very different to the psychological recovery. And at the time, I said let's pause on the mental impact. I said let's revisit it a bit later on in the season. And I do think now's probably the perfect time after what we saw in 407. You look at how he's still blaming Rock. In his mind, he's obsessed with Rock. It was all her fault. She was the one to blame. He's kind of actually gone into Ronnie Mathis mode in some aspects. The way he bumped into Crystal earlier on in the season, and just kind of turned around and gave this look, you can imagine Ronnie kind of doing something very similar. And I do think if it was Ronnie, it probably would have hit even different, because of how emotionless and cold he was. But you can see how Ronnie almost beating Unique to death back in 305. How it's actually brought out a few of his brother's traits in him, which is a very dangerous place to be. Not just for Unique, but for anyone who gets in his way or is around him. However, I do also think his temper and anger could potentially cause problems a bit later on. Just have a look at how he was with Panessa. She couldn't believe her eyes in 407. She thought Unique was long gone, only for him to reappear out of nowhere. In this conversation, she tried to make him see logical sense in terms of questioning. Why on earth would Rock work with Ronnie? That just doesn't make sense. But he immediately flipped a switch. At this moment in time, he's not seeing anything other than his own version of events, and his brain injury is definitely one of the big reasons as to why. He's definitely tapped into this inner Ronnie for sure, where he's thinking, fuck Rock. Now this is where I think his anger and controlling ways may potentially backfire at some point in the next 2 to 3 episodes. Sure, he is looking after Panessa and Jerome. Even when he was in the shadows, he was still making sure he took care of them. But controlling someone in the way he is, to the point where Panessa can't even go to see her own moms, who needs medical care, that's just not going to work in the long term. Having this apartment here is all good, until Panessa ends up losing her mind, where she's just cooped up out here, not being able to live her regular life. When will Panessa say enough is enough, when Unique blows his short fuse of his again? Because he definitely will. I just hope he doesn't go too crazy where he pulls a move like Tommy did with Holly, because I can definitely see a situation where Panessa actually tells Rock, do you know what, you were right, you had nothing to do with Unique, I do love him, but he's not the same person as he was before. And if Rock really is looking for a way in and to attack Unique, maybe Panessa could still potentially be an avenue. That's only if this situation gets way too much for Panessa. I personally can see entering very dangerous territory for Panessa, but I do think there's going to be a moment where she says she can't do this with Unique, and if she does, how will Unique react? only one can imagine the rage. So, this situation with Panessa and Unique's anger, his temper problem, and Unique's mental state with CTE and his brain injury, there's a reason why Joey Badass and Sasha Penn spoke so much about it prior to season 4. It's impacting a lot of his decision making, and frankly, who he is, how he's actually returned, which is now actually part Unique, part Ronnie Mathis. Now, in terms of Unique's street operation, he's in a very strong position at this moment in time. He's taken Rock and the Thomases by complete surprise. They don't know what's hit them, how Unique survived, who helped them, who was actually Early Tyler. I do wonder actually if that bit of information does come out a bit later on. But they have no idea how he's become so strong until they got a bit of answers from Stefano a bit later on. But it's way too late anyway. He's starting to take control over the streets again, and he's also hurting Rock's operation she had with the Chinese restaurants. Kwan's probably used his connections with his family to take the restaurants back, and that's another way Unique is going to hurt Rock. She's also got a month to wait to get her new product from a new connect, and in those couple of weeks, just imagine how strong Unique is actually going to be, with the backing of Phil Russo, Kwan, Akbar, and even more territory in Queens. Unique is only going to get stronger. Now, not only that, Rock and Marvin think that Stefano could actually make an agreement or a deal with Phil Russo and the people out in New Jersey to sell out the Thomases. So, they want to get ahead of the curve and attack Stefano. But this is just playing straight into Phil Russo and Unique's hands, because just like Phil Russo mentioned back in 406, once you start weakening Stefano's position, his own people will do it for him. And if Stefano is moved to the side by the Italian crime families, who's probably next in line to take over the territory that he has control over? Maybe perhaps Phil Russo. Someone from the Italian crime family would definitely have to step in. And that's what Phil Russo is probably eyeing up, as well as revenge for the death of Sal Baselli, of course. These Italians always find a way of backstabbing each other and taking each other's stuff, but they never do it themselves. Proxy wars. They're gonna use other people to fight for them, which is why I think they're the real enemy and the real threat. Unique and Rock were right to team up at the end of season 2. Southside together is strong. Those guys higher up just use everybody else like pawns in their proxy wars. Even though it is an alliance, Phil Russo is definitely just using Unique. Stefano's been using Marvin, and if they were to get into a war with those out in New Jersey, who do you guys think Stefano's going to turn to? But taking out Stefano is just playing straight into Unique and Phil Russo's chess game, and it really is going to be interesting to see how this unfolds, because I don't think the Thomases have another choice anyway. Stefano's looking to kind of get rid of Rock, so the Thomases have to make their move, but it's also falling straight into the other trap. That's why Unique is in a very strong position at this moment in time, which is why I can't seem to think of or find a way of how Rock could potentially strike back. Panessa helping Rock could potentially be a possibility, when and if she realizes this Unique is completely out of control. That could potentially be one way, but other than that, how can Rock really hit Unique? Now, not only is Unique in a very strong position in the streets, he's also made a move with Snaps and Pop, although we as the audience don't exactly know what was said in this conversation between them. We can only assume Unique was here to potentially create another alliance, just like Rock and Marvin tried to do earlier on in 407. Why not go to two of the most respected and powerful former drug dealers? Having someone like Snaps and Pop in your corner, now that would really make Unique a force to be reckoned with. I think he's probably made Snaps and Pop a proposal for a very handsome financial return. Snaps and Pop are retired, and to stay retired is very expensive. So, I wouldn't be surprised if he's made a very high financial proposal to both Snaps and Pop. Now, the ultimate play would be to take Kanan. These are two characters who, over the last couple of seasons, have known of each other. They've seen each other once or twice, but they've never really interacted, because the storyline and where they were in terms of their positions, it wouldn't make sense for them to. They were at two opposite ends of the spectrum. But over the seasons, that gap has definitely started to become a lot more closer. And you can probably sense that meeting and interaction getting even closer. And who's the common party or link? Snaps and Pop. We also have to think about where is Kanan with his relationship with Rock at this moment in time. At this moment, he still thinks that she had something to do with Famous's death. Even if that doesn't prove to be true, he's still probably going to blame Rock. You've got Unique who thinks Rock set him up, and then you'll have Kanan who thinks that she got rid of his best friend. Kind of similar to the situation with the older Kanan and Tariq, how they found themselves back in season 3 episode 8, where they both shared their hatred towards Ghost. Unique will know that the one way to hurt Rock is by targeting Kanan, not necessarily by killing him, because we all know based on power that's not happening, but he can definitely turn the screw and turn him even more against Rock. But I also think that's a very dangerous game at the same time. We all saw what happened with Ronnie and how Kanan turned on him. At the end of the day, this is still his mother. I think a lot will probably depend on whether Rock was involved in Vamous's murder, and even if she wasn't, is she somehow able to convince Kanan that she wasn't? Let's see. Either way, I do think we are getting closer and closer to that Kanan and Unique meeting, and it will be interesting to see how things start to unfold thereafter. But that's where we are with Unique's character at this moment in time, heading into the home stretch for Season 4. We've been through his mindset in terms of his rage and his anger problem, and how it also could potentially backfire. But going into Episode 8, the most intriguing thing about Unique's next move is his alliance with Snaps and Pop. What was said in this conversation, and how could it potentially shift the dynamics of the chessboard? Drop all your thoughts down below in the comment section, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.